representatives from the state energy agencies to join us. Here we go. I'm going to bring everybody up here and see if all 5 of us can fit on this stage. So as they're bringing them forward, here we go. Yep. So first up I've got here, and I think Siva's coming on next, but I have Angelina Golitova.
Exactly right. You know you practiced.
Angelina is the first woman chair of the Board of Governors of the California Independent System Operator. I have here also Siva Gunda. Siva is the vice chair of the Energy Commission in his first year as commissioner. And Ed Randolph, Ed has a very long title, Deputy Executive Director for Energy and Climate Policy at the Public Utilities Commission. Well, at least for the next 30 days. Then I'm just going to call him Hey You. As well as the man who has had his finger on the pulse of Sacramento for more than 4 decades, Kip Lipper, Chief Policy Advisor to the Senate Pro Tem, Tony Atkins. So, team, thank you so much for joining me today. I know you also have really busy schedules, but it's a great time, December 1st, to have you up here. And I know that we have, I was saying to folks, you might not have joined earlier, we have over 450 people registered here today. So don't be nervous. We're just going to have a nice moderated discussion to talk about the issues facing the state. But to begin with, I want you both, each of you, to take a turn to answer the question, what's on the agenda? And I'm going to go to Kip first. I want to start with you. What can we expect in the legislature in 2022?
Well, let me start with what was on the docket for 2021, which was left over. A lot of you probably know that the legislative session is a 2-year session. And so the second year of this session is 2022. And what I would say is, sort of macro, I think we're not done with COVID, which means the process within the legislature of public policy making will still be challenging as it has been for the last year. The good news is in 2021, the Newsom recall was kind of a penumbra over the legislative session as well. And I think that's obviously been disposed of. And then I think we will continue something that is unique to 2021 and into 2022, and that is historic federal and state spending of monies that are coming from the federal government from various infrastructure packages, and then also the kind of one-time massive bump in state revenues that have come in as a result of the economic circumstances in California, estimated by the Legislative Analyst's Office to be about $31 billion. 2022 will also be a year when the holdovers.
Oh. And just as he was getting exciting here.
He's still talking.
Kip, I can't hear you. Can folks? Nope. Okay, backstage team, we can't hear Kip. Do you want to take him down and adjust that, and we'll bring him back up? Okay. All right. So no pressure here, but maybe, Angelina, I could turn to you. What's
Sure.
on the agenda for the ISO?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and together with all of the other agencies, because this is an era when we're all working together to solve a common problem. And we're all proud and happy to be living in the 5th largest economy in the world that is dedicated to 100% renewable energy. And looking into the future and what our system is going to look like as we transition to more renewables and more technologies, it's increasingly going to be distributed, diversified, digitized, decarbonized, and democratized. And as we transition again to more and more renewables, the traditional system of generation following load and generation ramping up when you have load is changing a little bit to where we need to be more flexible and ensure that load can follow generation, and we increase load exactly when we have more generation, especially when we're relying on renewables such as solar and wind energy. The focus for the ISO, especially and with the other agencies, has always been reliability and resilience. And to ensure reliability and resilience in an era with the duck curve, where we've got a flexibility demand at the end of the day between 4 and 9 p.m., of over 17,000 megawatts at this point, expected to be 25,000 megawatts of ramping needed by 2030, we need to focus on the net energy peak load and ensure that we've got a reliable supply of energy for every single hour of every single day, 365 days a year. Now, the ISO has been very successful in trailblazing the integration of renewables. We even reached 94.5% of carbon-free energy on the grid this year. We know we can do it. Yes, it was only for a few minutes. The challenge now is how do we do it every single hour of every single day? And the challenges that we have, which are also opportunities, because every challenge is an opportunity, of course, is to ensure that we have that flexibility for the ramp. So that's our number one challenge. Flexible resources on the grid at the end of the day, being able to meet that ramp that lasts for 3 to 4 hours of 17,000 megawatts going to 25,000 megawatts. That we have enough resources to do that and to meet that demand at the end of the day, because that's when the system is most stressed. So having enough resources and capacity is also very important. And third, which is probably last but not least, is long-term storage. What is the long-term storage need? Because if we are, again, relying on batteries and relying on solar, and we've also mapped out that there are certain days of the year where we don't have enough sunlight and we don't have enough wind to charge the batteries in order to be able to operate the system. So bulk storage and long-term storage is extremely important for all of us to be able to work together. Moving forward, the way I look at it always is horizontal and vertical integration. So the horizontal integration, of course, will be building on the very successful energy imbalance market that California launched in 2014. It is wildly successful to where now it covers over 83% of the Greater West and has netted more than $1.8 billion in benefits to all of the customers. So making green while going green has been a good idea. It has decarbonized the Greater West, because more efficient resources have been the ones that have actually been picked up. And the less efficient resources, such as coal, we've seen pretty much being shut down across the board. We are going to be building on that very successful initiative with the day-ahead market, and I'm happy to talk about that later as well, because I'm sure we'll be discussing it. And of course, then the vertical integration, which is near and dear to Siva's heart, which is integrating demand energy response, electric vehicle transportation, and ensuring that behind-the-meter customer-owned technologies can be aggregated to support the grid and grid operations, so that we can unleash all the capabilities that the technologies that customers are installing right now can be utilized to support the grid, and we can monetize those assets for the customers. And this would then be, again, a way for us to move forward as we decarbonize California and transition to 100% renewable energy by 2045, or maybe even 2035 if we're to follow the mandate from the federal government at this stage of the game. But we're on a good track. We're moving well. California ISO is confident that we can meet California's goals and policies, and we stand ready to support the state in its decarbonization efforts.
Okay, well, thanks for those introductory comments, and let's turn to the state here. Siva, let's go to you. I'm sure Angelina is correct. We have some common goals here, but I want to talk specifically about the Energy Commission and what's on the agenda for 2022. And I believe that you are one of the lead commissioners on the Integrated Energy Policy Report this year, so maybe you talk about that focus there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Beth, can you hear me okay? So
yes.
Just want to make sure that, that the audience know that I might drop here and there and come back. So I'm actually calling from Miramar Naval Base. We're here kind of checking out the microgrid and visiting all the great work that the Navy has been doing and learning from them. So just want to begin by saying thank you, Beth, so much for inviting CEC to be a part of this conversation. It's always a pleasure to be on the dais with Angelina, Ed, and Kip, and it's just great company. I think, the 2020 and 2021 really kind of pulled together focus on a key different elements that are both structural and social, right? So we have the reliability issues that came to focus, the urgency to transition to a clean energy. We have the IPCC report saying it's code red for humanity. And then you also have, the social justice movement, taking, full bear at thinking through how can this transition be really equitable. I think that sets the stage for the CEC and then next year's work for CEC. As you noted, Beth, I will be leading the IPER next year. So really grateful to have that opportunity and be working with Chair Hochschild leading that. I think before I kind of go into the priorities, I think I just want to set the stage on what CEC does in terms of the state policy development. I think CEC has a very critical role in serving as a neutral venue for ideation and developing options for various transitional pathways. So those options are there, and then when we move from the ideation phase to more of a planning and implementation phase, there needs to be more work done, but we at least know the broad strokes of what the options could be, taking into account kind of diverse and robust stakeholder perspectives. So the focus areas for IPER 2022, as I kind of started off, it's going to be energy transition and equity. That's going to be the overarching theme. And when we talk about energy transition and equity, as Angelina mentioned, agree with her 100% on all the points that she made. I think it's important as we move forward for some of the solutions to come to bear that we all really collaborate, and that means that everybody in the state feels like they have a voice, and then they are able to provide input into moving into this energy transition. There are big issues: distributed energy in a DERs as a whole, natural gas transition. When we talk about zero zero carbon dispatchable and firm resources, and we talk about hydrogen or CCS and all these things, they're on the table in terms of ideas, but we haven't gone through a process where we have a robust discussion to say, what are some of the trade-offs here? We're talking about reliability, we're talking about safety, we're talking about equity and energy access. So I think much of our work next year is going to take into account developing a framework for decision-making around some of these transitional pathways, including the non-energy benefits and such. So I'm really excited to talk about that. Obviously, tangential to those issues will be the discussion on the regional growth of the market and how can that support the broader work. It could also kind of go into thinking through how do we think about rates and how do we think about some of the contingency plans when we talk about reliability, right? So when we talk about reliability, we plan for one outage every 10 years. But when we are talking about extreme climate impacts and then covering that last one event, how do we do it? It's going to come from ratepayers, or it's other broader strategies. So there's a lot of things to think about here.
There's a lot there, Siva. We could pick any of those topics and have a good discussion. But before we do that, I want to check and see if Kip's mic is working again. Kip, can you hear us, and can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Oh, we've got some clapping going on from the crowd. So they're loving that you're back. Let's go to you then, just in case you drop off. You were just starting to get excited. Well, I have to say, while you were gone, everybody agreed that the problems are all, the fault of the legislature, and you just didn't get it right, Kip. So sorry about that. But why don't you take away? I think you were transitioning into 2022 and talking about what's on the agenda.
Yeah, I think 2022 will be a lot of holdovers from 2021. I think the governor's energy package that was proposed as part of the budget, which I don't know if you heard that part of my presentation, it's roughly a $735 million package related to CCS, hydrogen investment, long-term bulk energy storage, and a variety of other issues. So that will be back on the docket. I do think we will be continue to be challenged by COVID, which means the legislative process itself will be difficult. And oftentimes these negotiations end up being behind closed doors with the governor's office and the legislature, as opposed to in the committee hearings, which is my preference. And I know your preference as well. But I do think those will be big issues. And as I mentioned, and maybe did not get caught at the end, the Senate is working on a big energy and climate package that I believe will be made public later in the year or in early January, that is intended to look and focus on the energy sector and on some of the issues associated with SB 100 implementation and related activities. So that's my quick and dirty, Beth. I hope everybody heard that part.
Yeah, no, especially this idea that there's a packet coming out. I want to dive into that a little bit more in the roundtable discussion, particularly as we talk about SB 100. But first, let's go to Ed Randolph. Ed, if folks don't know, you have been at the Public Utilities Commission now, I think, a full decade, and are leaving at the end of this month. So we will miss you, and I think everyone's curious to know what you're going to be doing next.
First off, I've been at this current job. I'm in a PUC a little bit more than a decade, but today is my anniversary day, 10-year anniversary day for this job here as the Director of Energy Division / Deputy Executive Director for Energy and Climate Policy there. And I am just as excited to find out what I will be doing next as well. I'm leaving the PUC because it is time for new adventures. But it is really hard to figure out what your new adventure is with a job that takes as much of my time as this one does out there. So it's time for a little bit of a breather and then to figure out what's next. And so that's for me. I think most people probably care a lot more about what's next for the PUC than what's next for me. And so just moving through this quickly, looking at the PUC, I would say while there's a lot of moving parts going on in the energy field, and I mean, I could list down a ton of different proceedings that are out there, but to theme these up, I think the driving things that are going to really move a lot of conversations next year come down to two issues: infrastructure and affordability. And on the infrastructure side, we have directives now between a 2019 order and a 2021 order for 14,800 megawatts of new resources that need to be online by 2026, spread out over that time frame. Of those new resources, almost all of that, if not all of that, is going to be carbon-free resources. There are some instances where you may see a little bit of new gas, but most of that is either by the resource need or specific direction of the PUC will be carbon-free resources out there. So a lot of the work outside of the proceedings is going to be focused on what does it take to make sure we get those resources built. Unfortunately, from the last year of tracking a lot of projects that were supposed to come online in the last year, and of that, we've gotten 2,100 megawatts of new resources, almost all storage that came online between August of 2020 and 2021. But we did learn a lot on what the agencies collectively can be doing to make sure that there aren't permitting issues, supply chain issues, that we catch these issues early on in the planning process, so things can go as smoothly as possible in that development stage. And that includes now, requirements for load serving entities to be reporting into the PUC on, milestones and executing contracts. There is now a joint agency task force between the Governor's Office of Business Development, GoBiz, the Energy Commission, the PUC, and the ISO that meets bi-weekly. That is tracking projects out there. We have learned, very quickly on the need to sometimes outreach to local governments and have them understand the criticality of a permit that may be sitting on their desk somewhere out there. We've gone as far as to call the Port of Long Beach recently and ask them to move ships up in the queue to get resources off of that, which they've been willing to do. So that's going to be a big part of the behind the scenes efforts over the next year, and then lots of public efforts on that as well. The second big issue on infrastructure is going to be the continuation of wildfire mitigation. Those plans from the utilities continue to evolve and to develop, but those are multi-billion-dollar investments per year. I think with an increasing emphasis on undergrounding, mine, and I think a lot of people's hope is as the utilities invest in some research and more undergrounding, that those costs become more and more reasonable, and that becomes a more viable path to wildfire mitigation down the road on the utility side of things out there. Those two things up there, those two infrastructure things, are big, massive investments. And so that leads to the third thing on there of priorities, which is affordability out there. And we know from research and papers that the PUC has done, an embank we did earlier this last year, and open proceedings we have specifically focused on affordability, that this is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge within California. It used to be that we talked about having high rates, but low bills compared to national averages. Unfortunately, it's becoming high rates and high bills. And so we need to focus more on that. It's always worth noting when we start talking about affordability, what is not driving increased bills is our commitment to clean energy. Study after study shows in the long term, our commitment to clean energy will, depending upon the study you look at, result in same cost as a business as usual case. And in most studies show will be cheaper in the long term than sticking with a business as usual case. So that is not what's the driver of this. What is the driver of it? One is other investments such as the wildfire mitigation expenditure, which is a really large driver in these costs. But the other in the short term is not the investment in clean energy per se, but the amount of resources that are going to need to come online over the next 6 years to ensure reliability. And the essence is, and the reality is, we're front loading a lot of the build we need to get to our 2030 and our 2045 goals because of the reliability needs that the state is facing today. We can talk more about that in questions and answers if we want. But because it's being front loaded, that means a lot of projects will show up in rates in 2024, 2025 that otherwise would have been spread out over a longer period of time. And so we need to get creative how we spread those costs back out and keep things affordable. What are the tools that are out there that we can use that we'll be looking at? One that Kip has hinted at a little bit there is some of these projects may be better funded by general fund money or by federal investment money. And to the extent that they're bringing broader societal goals, if society as a whole can pay for them, that really reduces the impact on ratepayers as a whole. We need to look at new ways to finance these things, potentially financing authorities or other things that can lower the financing costs and the investment cost, which all of that is always passed on to ratepayers out there. Maybe more use of securitization, where long-term, the longer-term benefits are also spread out and longer-term costs out there. And then finally, we need to look at how we define affordability. What is an affordable utility bill? Something that very few states have ever done, that California's never done. We're trying to understand now through some proceedings. And that will likely lead to changes in tariffs and rates to better equalize the cost of the infrastructure to people's ability to pay for it. Those are the big things that I'd like to touch on.
So Ed, I want to pick up with the group here. I think some people want to respond to some of the things that you've said there and provide some of their ideas. Before I do that, so folks, be prepared. I'm going to go to this issue of affordability and the bills and some of these ideas that Ed put down here. But before I do that, I want to just say to the audience, you are able to ask questions in the panel to the right. There is a Q&A. You can submit your questions, and then the team at the back are kind of going through and sending some forward to me. At about 10 past, in about 30 minutes, I'm going to go to the Q&A. So send in your questions now. And if you have one that you want a particular person to answer, make sure that you direct it to them. Okay, back to the roundtable here. Affordability, vulnerable communities, bills. I mean, we've been through a really tough couple of years, right? There are some folks that are really suffering. We still, utilities, CCAs, we're disconnections. I know that technically at the end of September, the suspension was lifted, but until monies are dispersed, some of the utility relief, that won't happen. And so I want to go first to this question. If that's the case, if you're saying we're flushed with funds, and I think Kip talked about that as well, what can we be doing, both in the legislature and maybe Kip, I should start with you on this. Should some of that money go towards cutting rates? How would that work?
Yeah, what I would say is I think Edward touched on it pretty well, which is we ought to look at using this one-time money. And I want to emphasize that it's one-time money. It's not ongoing, but we ought to emphasize using that money for societal investments that move us closer to our climate and clean energy goals. So, and I think Newsom has started that to some extent with this conversation about this energy package, which is, as proposed, somewhat modest and maybe off topic in the sense that what we knew maybe a year ago or we're thinking about, we might want to update a little bit. But what I will say is I do think that looking at this one-time largesse of federal and state funds and putting it to use to help meet our climate and clean energy goals. And I might say that is not strictly in the electricity sector or the natural gas sector. It should be much broader than that. But I do think that's a very important premise and one of the pillars of what the Senate is looking at. The other thing I would say, I think Ed is right. I think rates and affordability are important. And I think the key drivers there are wildfire spending. I would also add to that the net energy metering cost shifts that I know the PUC is looking at, and then also transmission investments. And remember, the Biden infrastructure plan, among other things, has some one-time money in it for transmission infrastructure investments. So there's some really interesting and positive synergies there that we can take a look at. Also, and I hope Siva doesn't take this the wrong way or Edward, because I think we all know the PUC and the Energy Commission can do no wrong. But I do think a little bit more accountability on the agencies to make sure that they actually come through on deliverables. And we're not just talking about something 25 years, 30 years into the future that an executive order talks about, but maybe some milestones and some specific benchmarks that are met much sooner, say in the 2025, 2030 timeframe is important as well.
Siva and Angelina, did you guys want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, affordability is always very important, and I do agree both with Ed and with Kip that we do need to figure out how to lessen some of the pain, but also how to ensure that those funds go to infrastructure investments to meet our climate goals. And what can we do to ensure that vulnerable communities have access to cleaner technologies, that they're incentivized to own these technologies, starting with energy efficiency, of course, going into electric vehicles too, that both help the community reduce the cost of operation of their vehicles or their homes or their businesses as well, and have access to the new technologies that some of the others enjoy, both for health reasons and for economic reasons. So yes, people do pay a bill. Energy efficiency being the most important and cutting kilowatt hours is the most valuable of all. But then how can we incentivize disadvantaged communities to have more access to solar technologies that are certainly lower cost, to battery storage that helps them balance that solar technology and maybe even monetize it by providing support to the grid, access to electric vehicles and charging, which would be cheaper to operate than a gas clunker they may be driving right now. So all of these programs that we look at implementing in third world countries to where you're giving people solar energy, which is cheaper on a per month basis than buying kerosene and wood, and helps them both economically as well as in terms of healthcare costs, and transitioning the same philosophy to not burdening a customer with having to pay for expensive technologies up front, because as Ed pointed out, renewable energy and clean technologies are front loaded. the high cost is up front, the operational cost is lower. So how do we take that pain away and ensure that we have a smoother runway for customers as we all transition, and especially for the most vulnerable customers as we all transition to a carbon-free economy?
So I'm just going to channel my neighbor, right, who tells me they don't want to buy an electric car. And one of their arguments is that, yes, gas prices are going up, but their electricity bill is going up as well. So maybe Siva, if electricity bills go up faster than gas prices, customers are going to stop buying electric cars. But more than 40% of the emissions are from transportation sectors, so it's imperative that we transition off fossil fuels. As we decarbonize the transportation sector, how do we maintain reliability and keep bills as low as possible? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, I think just kind of going back to kind of tying the pieces that both Ed and kind of Angelina talked about, as well as Kip, is just kind of looking at, the overarching issue of the rates, right? Just kind of understanding, there is this one-time, money that's coming from the state. There's money from the federal government, as Kip kind of used the word. There's a really good synergy right now to understand where that money can go in terms of putting investments that can lead us to long-term and short-term benefits for the consumer. So I think I just want to reiterate that point. So on the point of just kind of that you raised in terms of the gasoline prices are going up, as well as the electricity prices are going up. One of the questions I think we ought to kind of just set a 30,000 foot level set, right, which is, we don't really look at the true cost of things, when we talk about climate, right? So we don't really look at non-energy benefits. So if you look at the non-energy benefits, and then you look at really capturing, the climate impacts of a lot of the conventional resources today, just kind of as a level set, it's a very, very high cost. So we don't really reflect them in rates. We don't reflect them in any meaningful way in the economy today. And that kind of, gives this artificial sense that, the climate-driven investments could be more expensive than the status quo. So once you kind of take into account the non-energy impacts, the kind of looking at the cost to the climate, just at a high level, 10,000 foot level, the cost of everything we are trying to do will be significantly lower. So the next point from there is, so as we make this transition, how do we make sure that the costs are low? The costs are reasonable as we move forward. And I think there's no easy answer, right? So the first thing is climate change is real. And I'm glad that we're in a state where that is widely accepted, that is happening, that need to be confronted. And as you mentioned, and as Angelina mentioned, the cost of climate is not just in terms of CO2, but when we talk about air quality impacts, the health impacts, the water impacts, it is a much larger issue in terms of the cost to the consumer. So then kind of you're looking at, okay, so climate change is real, and we are all on the same page that we need to make this transition equitable, that the benefits of the climate goals that we do are equally distributed and equitably distributed for all Californians. So if you kind of put those two as non-negotiable things, then it's all about how do you reduce the cost on the other end. And that's where I think this one-time funding from the federal government or the funding from the general fund really helps mitigate that. But I think I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a clear answer on that one. But I think as you think about that the need for reducing the costs, it's incumbent upon the agencies to come up with ideas. It's incumbent upon the state to really think about how do we make that investment.
See, Kip gave a little wave there. You want to jump in?
I just wanted to second what Siva said. I thought it was really good. These are societal costs now. What we're seeing from climate change is we talk about extreme heat and death and the health effects of that. We talk about the wildfires, the smoke, and the horrible impacts of wildfires. Some related to utilities, some not. We talk about the impacts of drought, which is a multi-billion-dollar impact on California's economy and industry. And we talk about the impacts of sea level rise, something that Senator Atkins, my boss, is very much involved in, where you're going to see parts of California inundated not in the next 100 years, but in the next 10, 15, 20 years as a result of these impacts. These are societal costs. And we have one of the paradigms that we've established in California is some of these costs are loaded onto utility rates. And as Siva mentions, they are societal costs. And I think we need to be looking at better ways to fund those that are not saddling them on utility rates. I mean, the public at some level is going to pay them one way or another. It may be through general taxes. It may be through other charges like the cap and trade program. But the bottom line is these are broader costs, and we need to look at ways to keep utility rates affordable, as Ed has mentioned, but at the same time, acknowledge that there are these other costs that simply can't be hidden from or buried. And I think your point about the electric vehicle is a really good one. The exponential benefits of an electrification are not easily seen when you're just going out and buying a car or signing up for electrical charging.
So I find this conversation very encouraging. Yeah, sure, Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, Beth, just kind of real quickly, a little repetitive, but a little kind of pushback too. The term non-energy benefits oftentimes gets the hair on the back of my neck up a little bit. And it's because it's usually used around me in the PUC regulatory process to say, when you're doing a cost and benefit analysis around an energy program, you should include non-energy benefits in that. And then that gets in there to say, basically, the ratepayers should be paying for the non-energy benefits. And that gets to the rub that we're at right now, that there is a breaking point. We aren't there. Where electric rates get so high that we can't rely on electricity to solve these problems in the other parts of the economy. And so there's two things in there. One that everybody's already kind of agreed on here. This is like using government money and other funds for some of the societal benefits is going to be critical to making all this work together. But the other is, I honestly think the state as a whole has gotten through the easy part of climate change, which is getting the inertia going to decarbonize the electric sector. Most of the energy or GHG reductions we've gotten so far is from the electric sector. There's still work to be done, don't get me wrong, but we're on the right path. The heavy lifting is still the transportation sector. And we've got to tackle that. We've got to figure out how to make that work in conjunction with electric rates and keeping electric rates affordable and not in opposition to that. And I'll just note too, from our en banc analysis out there, if you look at a lot of the electrification proposals out there around transportation electrification, that does drive up electric rates some, at least for the foreseeable future. There's a point where they start going down again. But if you look at the average household bill, because of the reduction in the gasoline cost, you actually see good, overall reductions in overall household expenses, which just begs us, we really need to find more ways to look at all this and not kind of agency by agency or sector by sector.
So, and I wanted to, can I very quickly jump into, I'm sorry, and I do agree with everybody that we do need to capture the environmental externalities, and we need to assign those costs to the technologies and to the sources that are responsible for those environmental externalities and increased social costs in healthcare, in air pollution, in water quality, and everything, and droughts and everything that everyone has been talking about. And it certainly shouldn't only be the electric sector. The electricity sector has become quite cleaner, and now we need to focus on transportation. So how do we go forward with the systems approach? Because electricity and electric vehicles and storage and DER are intricately connected. And looking on a household by household basis, going back to your neighbor, it is not just the expense of electricity for charging that car. And if they had storage and maybe solar on their home, it would be cheaper. And if we can incentivize those technologies and it's part of a microgrid, then becomes even more beneficial because we can monetize those resources for your neighbors. So they're not only paying for the electricity to charge their car, but they're benefiting from payments that they may get because they're supporting the grid with that vehicle, or they're reducing the net energy peak at the end of the day because their vehicle is plugged in. So having smart technologies, vehicle to grid charging, time of use charging can benefit your neighbor to have a vehicle that, even though electricity costs may be higher, the operation of that vehicle may be a lot lower depending on their desire and ability to become interconnected in a system that allows them to pool and monetize those resources. And that can apply to appliances in the home and to a lot of other technologies that customers are increasingly installing in their homes. So if we mandate that, just like we're mandating electric vehicles are the only vehicles sold in California after 2035, so that issue is kind of going to be taken care of. I think the focus is going to be all of us working together. How do we minimize the costs for those customers? And indeed, how do we allow them to benefit monetarily from paying for those technologies and having them on site? And maybe the one-time incentive can go towards reducing the first cost of customers having those technologies, starting with the disadvantaged communities.
So I want to move on to some other awesome topics, but this has been a really good conversation, and I've seen a lot of clapping going on. I want to ask one question on behalf of the audience. This discussion around rates, one-time benefit that you talked about, KIP, one-time maybe payment through federal dollars or state dollars. Ed, you mentioned the en banc that the CPUC did on rates. Where do we go? So for the audience here, where do they go for this conversation? Should they be talking to their legislators about it? Do you think there might be an oversight hearing on this next year? Ed, on the agenda for the PUC, are there going to be further en bancs in 2022 about this issue?
Well, I'll pipe in real quick on just affordability in general. There is a long-standing, actually, open proceeding. It's moved along at a very deliberate pace, but I'm actually quite proud of what the commission's doing there, where we have spent a couple years out there, defining affordability. I mean, it sounds weird to define that in the electric sector. We have always looked at our low-income programs as, a kind of a straight percentage load reduction on the bill. And haven't looked at things holistically. And so now we have tools that are out there where we can look at, people's bills holistically, look at them, and what their telecommunications bill is, what their gas bill is, what their gasoline bill is, and look at that to define what's affordable to households in different regions with different needs out there. And then I think what that leads, new rate structures always are different rate structures out there. And, using things like fixed charges, which can be, incentives to get people to electrify their homes or do electric vehicles, but at the same time, as the means of creating those affordability metrics out there, or, not creating them, but solving those affordability issues.
Okay, well, let's move on to another topic that I know people are very, very interested in, and all of you mentioned this. This past year, we have this very large procurement order, probably the largest in the history of the state. It
is the largest in the history, not probably.
Thank you. And it's capacity. So for, people that don't maybe talk our lingo, there's nameplate megawatts, and this is a capacity megawatt. So it's a lot more than you might think. But you also mentioned, so the procurement orders are out there. The load serving entities know what it is that they need to do. There are some accounting rules behind it. But you highlighted that this year we ran into problems. Folks can execute power purchase agreements. Everybody can be on the same page about the timing, when we expect all of this to come online. And then we have a pandemic, and then we have issues around supply chain, which you've spoken about. Interconnection issues I know came up this year, Ed, in order to make sure that some of these new projects got online in time. Land use permitting opposition has been an issue. You talked about that. But I want to then talk a little bit about transmission capacity. because that's another one that I think that load serving entities, developers, policymakers, I hear them all talking about. Just take a step back and maybe could someone explain who's in charge of that? What agency has those items on the agenda for next year?
Well, short answer on the last of all of that is all of us have that on our agenda for next year. For better or for each of the agencies plays a role in transmission planning. I mean, the good things are under Commissioner Douglas of the CEC's leadership, there is this process that's had workshops and has biweekly meetings of the agencies talking about transmission planning. That I won't go through everybody's on work streams, but the CAISO is very much focused on resolving issues with their interconnection queue out there. I think there's enough resources in the queue right now if they were all built to power the entire United States. So there's some challenges there to work out there. Obviously, some of that's speculative, and so we need to work through some of that. And then from the PUC's end, both in the transmission and the IRP and that planning process, I think a key thing is really to become more transparent and more understandable, so people understand what we're thinking. And we did that. I don't think people realize that it used to be when we sent over our planning scenarios to the CAISO, that was signed as a letter from the lead commissioner in the integrated resource planning proceeding. And that was it. There was no vote. There was no public comment. There was none of that. And so this last year was the first time that actually was done as a vote of the commission. And I think it created more confusion than it helped, because a lot of people were all of a sudden just learning that process. But I think in the long run, that's really helpful in there. And there were good changes made in the plan as a result of the public input we got there. So those are, things that are out there. Also, the PUC energy division is very much working on creating quarterly forums to talk about with all of the LSEs the transmission planning process, where process and queue from the utilities. So the utilities are sharing where they stand with load serving entities. I think that's going to be critical, because I think what happens a lot with your members, Beth, is you execute a contract, but you don't have much visibility on what that developer, where they really are in the queue, what's really going on with them. And so you don't have the ability to do good risk assessment that project's going to come online on time. So we hope that by making a lot of this much more apparent, the load serving entities as a whole can make better contracting decisions by understanding what's going on throughout the process. And additionally, I think, a lot of pressure has got to be put on the utilities to streamline their processes. I think be more consistent. I get lots of feedback from folks that are like, well, on this project, they told me this, on this project, they told me that. They changed engineers in the middle of the interconnection engineering review, and everything changed. And I think, quite frankly, the utilities need to get more people, because there's a lot of work to be done, and they need to get more people.
I have a provocative question for you. Actually, I'm just curious, Ed. In your 10 years at the CPUC, has a new transmission line ever been permitted?
Yeah, a lot of them have. I couldn't list them off. We just permitted, there's a whole, we just permitted I'm blanking on the name of it, because these things, they change their names through the process. But one a few weeks ago, lots of smaller ones over time, projects that were identified in the TPP. One thing I just, while I'm saying that though, it just reminds me, and a kudos to the CAISO on this. We've seen a lot of these third-party transmission projects developed. And California always is knocked as well, you got to move faster, Then you start looking at the nation as a whole, and oftentimes we're the only ones doing it. And there have been some great projects, transmission upgrade projects built by third-party developers because of the CAISO's process that actually saved ratepayers lots of money relative to what the utility would have done.
Right, and improved reliability and resiliency too. Thank you, Ed. And some of them are owned by native tribes, and that is also a huge milestone forward as well. And again, the state came together and the agencies came together, and working together in cooperation, we shouldn't forget that we were able to find wires and non-wire solutions to be able to meet the 2,200 megawatts that we lost because of Sound and Norfolk nuclear power station shutting down. We had to work together and make sure that we were able to bring in the resources, many of them transmission and wire solution, to be able to meet that demand. So yes, we have a lot of renewable energy projects in the queue. California and the ISO is considered one of the globally leading agencies on integrating renewables on the grid. Our queue, as Ed pointed out, is huge. We have over 200,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects in the queue, and we have just as much storage. Some of the storage is co-located with renewable energy projects as well, keeping in mind that our peak load in California as a whole is 50,000 megawatts. So we do need a lot more resources as we push forward towards 2045. And it's gratifying to see that we do have more than enough resources in the queue that we can interconnect to meet that demand. And also wanted to point out that all of these solutions, the renewable energy solutions, the storage solutions, the DERs, the electric vehicle infrastructure solutions, lead to jobs, local jobs here in California that also benefit disadvantaged communities, because we can focus those training programs to embrace everybody needing a job and being interested to support their local community and the state to go into green careers, not just green jobs. So that's an important aspect too. It leads to economic development and makes everything more affordable.
Well, so speaking of that, and you just mentioned Diablo, Angelina. So I have a couple of questions there. One, what is the plan for the transmission lines at Diablo once it's closed? And also, I think
I mentioned San Onofre, not Diablo. That was down in Southern California. Right. Yes.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Diablo, and it triggered in my mind the report last month that folks were talking about, the joint Stanford-MIT report, where it claims that delaying retirement of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant in San Luis Obispo County until 2035 would reduce carbon emissions and save billions in power costs. Do any of you think that this is a viable option?
I think it's a red herring, frankly. I mean, the report basically focuses on you're going to need to do desal and you're going to need to do hydrogen generation that ultimately will cost more than California's initiative for reducing the cost of hydrogen, just to keep a nuclear power station that needs to be upgraded to hundreds of billions of dollars and sits not on 3, but on 8 earthquake fault zones. So, I mean, not to get into the details of whether we need nuclear or not, I did talk to PG&E about it, and they said that it was too risky to plan for any kind of extension for Diablo Canyon, that they don't see it as a resource that they need, and that they're moving forward with the plan that the state has adopted. And there has been no change, and they don't see any reason for a change at this stage of the game. So I'm not going to second guess them on that decision. And it's not needed for system reliability. We should focus on the transmission and the resources we need, the clean resources we need to replace Diablo, keep it at keep going forward to our climate goals, and meeting them with the lowest cost resources that provide the highest reliability and resiliency for our region. And Diablo doesn't fit in that plan.
Okay, anyone disagree? Because I think what you're saying is that ship has sailed.
Yes.
All in agreement? Okay. I guess the Stanford researchers didn't interview any of you. Okay, I'm going to throw out one more question, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A. And you've all been talking about it, but if I just think back a year ago, right, going into 2021 and thinking about what was on the agenda then, reliability was at the top of everyone's agenda. We had just been through the August 2020 extreme heat event. So my question to all of you is, did we make any progress this year in addressing reliability challenges, or are we still on the back foot heading into 2022? And Siva, I'm going to go to you. I haven't heard from you.
Yeah, So I was glad Angelina took the Diablo question, and I just want to say I think I want to commend the researchers always. When people put their heads on thinking about creative solutions, it was informative, but I think the level of complexity in making sure something like that could be turned around is kind of, I don't think it was robustly dealt in the paper as the reality on the ground is. So it's a lot more complicated than it appears to be on surface. And I want to give kudos to the researchers in the sense that they say there needs to be additional study. This was more of a directional work. So so just want to comment on that one. I was just waiting to see if I should or not. But then going into the question on reliability, I think 2020. I just want to give kudos outright to all the staff at the agencies. So since August 2020 through now, we've been about 18 months. Ed and his team, Pete, Scala, a number of colleagues at CPUC, number of colleagues at CEC and CAISO, Mark Rothleader, Elliot, who are all been working. It has been, the 2020 events really was impetus for all of us to come together and understand a common problem and work together. And I think in that sense, it has been a huge success. I think the ability in the need for the recognized need for collaboration, the need for working together, the transparency and communication between the organizations have improved a lot. So I think from 2020 to 2021, I would think in my book, we were prepared. We had a contingency plan. We had a number of things that we were tracking carefully, and we were much more prepared to systematically use the strategies that we've used in 2020 to mitigate any shortcoming. Having said that, the climate change, we had the July 9th event where we got about 4,000 megawatts of transmission line that we lost, transmission capacity, and you look at the extraordinary fire, drought, as well as heat all combined together. So even though we put out an analysis that said, oh, it's going to be really bad, what happened was worse. So I think we were prepared, and I think we've kind of moved together in terms of having a number of strategies to mitigate a shortfall. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, not for lack of trying, but just the complexity of climate change, the accelerated pace at which it's happening. And also want to recognize in this particular juncture that as we move towards climate goals, and this is where the equity question comes in, right? Which is when we were talking about reliability and we were talking about a public good for the state as a whole, we had choices, we had decisions to make around should we turn on diesel gensets and backup gensets at at various locations to keep the grid going, right? So that's an important element to think about. While we pursue our long-term goals, we cannot continue to impose the burden of reliability on disadvantaged communities or areas that are vulnerable. So kind of figuring that out. In that sense, it's not easy, but I think I just want to put it on the table that while I am appreciative of all the work we as agencies are doing, there are much more work to be done in ensuring that reliability does not come at the cost to vulnerable communities.
Okay. Anyone disagree with that or have anything to add?
I agree, Beth, but if I can jump in, a couple quick points here. One, I don't know that most people realize that the nature of this drought as it impacted the electricity sector was very different than past droughts. That in the past, droughts impact hydroelectric generation over the total energy they can produce, but they've always been able to save enough water in the reservoir to produce electricity during the peak demand hours in August and September. This is the first time major reservoirs where they were literally dropped below the pinheads for the power plants come August. So we lost way more hydroelectric resources than we would have anticipated based on historic droughts. And so that's something that's going to have to change in forecasting out there. But to the bigger question of we made progress, absolutely. And I want to go back a little bit here too to level set a little bit. The biggest problems that lead to some of these shortfalls are increased the two problems we identified in years past were, one, we're going to be able to rely on imports less and less during big heat events because the West as a whole is closing down their coal plants, good thing, and relying more on their renewable plants that we used to rely on. So we can't rely on that as much. The nature of solar, both rooftop and the big utility scale projects, mean our challenging hours now are in the evening, not in the middle of the day. And then the third one was we're just going to have more extreme events. Those first two events, actually, the PUC identified in 2018. And that was why we ordered 3,300 megawatts of new resources in 2019 to start meeting those shortfalls. I think what we missed was that these extreme heat events were going to come much sooner than everybody forecasted. And so while we were on track to meet this stuff, it all happened much earlier. The point I want to make, because this also will be relevant when people file comments in future proceedings about need, the other mistake the PUC made, and this is based on a lot of comments, and I'll be very critical of a former LA Times reporter on this as well, but the PUC made the ultimate decision, so we own it, was the move to a method of what has been labeled as just-in-time procurement. To basically say, okay, let's not procure the resources until the exact year that we need it, versus overbuilding a little bit. And that was the result of, I think, people feeling like the state was overbuilding. We had too much capacity. Quite frankly, the CEC chair at the time, the PUC chair at the time, and the president of the CAISO all spent a lot of time with a lot of folks and reporters saying, no. We have too much capacity in 2017. We're not going to have enough in 2021. But it put a lot of pressure on us to do this quote unquote no regrets procurement. Let's procure what we need and no more. Well, I regret the no regrets procurement because we should have procured more. We should have gone back to the way we used to, we did it for a while, which is, let's go ahead and procure a little bit more than what we think we need, because it's always going to be better to be long than short.
Interesting. So I promised I'd go to the Q&A, but actually somebody's asked the question that I meant to ask all of you is I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of a Western regional market. I think back, Kip, I think it was in the California legislature in 2018 that the legislature rejected a proposal that would have had to change the ISO governance needed to form a full regional energy market. I know, Angelina, you're a big fan of EIM and EDAM and all those acronyms that maybe you can explain in a moment. But one of my questions for all of you is when I think about the goals of SB 100 and when I talk to people about this, I hear a lot of folks saying it's time for us to think about a Western regional market again. Any response from any of you? Oh, somebody clapped there. Someone agrees. Who wants to take that first? I'm looking at Kip and Angela, and so Siva. Siva's got his hand up. Go for it.
No, I think I just want to. While we all calibrate the question, right? I think it's an important question to be asked right now, and I think there's a high level just kind of thinking through. Okay, so what, as you said, SB 100 goals. SB 100 goals require, based on the current modeling, anywhere from tripling or quadrupling the amount of resources that we have on the system today. So we have about 80 gigs in California, and then we're talking about anywhere from 250 to 350 megawatts, gigawatts of generation capacity. So then the next question from there is, within the SB 100 modeling, we did allow for some level of, out-of-state wind to be imported into the state, or offshore wind and such. So when we think about that, what the analysis kind of showed is that there is value, there is an economic value in the modeling in terms of having geographic as well as temporal diversity in resources. So I think that's just the kind of like the modeling suggesting that there is a value. And I think there's an observation that, whether solar, in the east, can have shapes that are supportive of us, or wind having shapes that are supportive of, a broader broader kind of regional level. So I think my kind of point of view on that one, I'm still kind of learning on this, is there is definitely value in being able to all of us work together, but the shape and the form it takes has to take into consideration not just the energy balance, supply and demand, but there's a lot of other issues. And I think, in order to be able to tackle some question like regionalization, you need to really understand what are all the variables that we are interested in learning about from a generation and from supply demand side. I think there's a huge value from the broader perspectives of economic growth in California, jobs and such. I think those are all important elements to honestly and transparently talk about, and look at how does that, the regional integration take shape. So I think that's kind of like where I stand. I'm kind of still learning about it, but I think the observations is there's value in working together regionally.
And I'll take a crack at that too. As you know, I am a huge fan of the energy imbalance market that allows us to optimize operations across the West. The West is unique in the fact that it doesn't have a regional transmission operator. There were 38 separate balancing authorities, each balancing demand and supply. So the energy imbalance market and the day-ahead market allow us to optimize those operations and not have as much reserves in every balancing authority, because people can work together across the board and share some of the burdens between the balancing authorities. It has been very successful because it was a voluntary market. It was a voluntary market that the ISO had an initiative to launch and allowed people to join on a voluntary basis, where they could come in, and actually their cost for joining the market was paid for in less than a year, and it was an economic benefit for everybody participating. It built the trust throughout the West of all of us working together, and as I mentioned initially, being able to organize horizontally to provide those benefits, as Siva pointed out, to where the temporal differences can be made up, because we do have a time difference, and different resources can supply different regions. We all depend on each other. We depend on the Pacific Northwest for hydro, and certainly felt the pain, as Ed pointed out, when the transmission line was downgraded by 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts this summer, and we didn't have the access to Pacific Northwest hydro. That was something we felt. And it was downgraded because of fires. And again, climate change. You can try to foresee the unforeseeable, but the droughts have been more extreme. The heat waves have been more extreme. The fires have been much more extreme, to where they've never had a fire like that in the Pacific Northwest, and we needed to account for it. And luckily, we were able to, because of working together and the resources that we had lined up, were able to ride through it. And that's going to continue for a while, because climate change is unpredictable. But being able to work with our neighbors, and as we decarbonize California, it's also important to note that many states throughout the West, and indeed throughout the U.S., now have robust portfolio requirements, just like we do, for zero carbon energy, whether it's New Mexico, whether it's Colorado, whether it's Washington and Oregon. We're all working together towards having a more decarbonized system. So regional integration can help us. The day-ahead market can help us. And we don't have to go into a very convoluted or a complex governance issue, because I think we've very elegantly handled governance up to now, with having the EIM governing body and the board of governors at the ISO work together. We had a governance review committee that actually optimized the governance for the EIM that completed their work this last August, and that was unanimously adopted by both boards. We're learning to work together with stakeholders. Trust is building throughout the West in terms of agencies working together with the ISO. The ISO has also become the reliability coordinator for the West, and we look forward to working with the partners. Horizontal integration is very important, just as vertical integration, to get to zero carbon and to get to being able to operate on 100% renewable energy. Again, 24/7, 365 days a year, every single hour of every single day. That's the focus.
So Angelina's got it down. Well, I have to go to Kip here, because I have to ask him. I mean, what Angelina just described, is that sufficient for you? Or do you feel that this has been a workaround to get around the legislature and not, I'm going to be frank. What do you think, Kip? Are we going to see another bill in the legislature next year, 2023? I know Chris Holden was very interested in regionalized market.
Yeah, I can't speak to what bills might or might not be introduced. I think that I have to say, listening to Siva and Angelina, my response is, remind me again what's broke that needs fixing. I mean, it sounds like, first of all, we all know California has a regional grid already. Edward and others just made reference to the fact the Northwest Hydro, the power that we import from the east, the future of offshore wind energy in California, all are factors to be taken into account. So I guess I would start with, how would a conversation or an effort once again to take away the accountability California has with its CalISO governing board further the goals of clean energy in California and in the West? And from what I've just heard, there's a lot of progress already being made on those fronts. And so it just seems to me to be kind of an effort that is misdirected in terms of what the energies are that we need to put into actually decarbonizing the grid. But having said that, I can't tell you whether a bill will be put in or not. I think the problem has always been the question is, how do we make the grid work better regionally? Not that it doesn't already operate regionally, but how do we make it work better regionally? And the answer for some is get rid of the CalISO governing board. And I'm not saying that because I'm defensive of Angelina. I'm saying because this was a very hard fought issue back during energy deregulation, and the accountability of California over its grid is, I think, an important thing to elected officials. I would note to those who support this stuff, changing the governance structure. And again, I want to make that distinction between changing the governance structure in California law versus a regional grid. Two different questions. But I do want to say changing the governance structure would, at least from what we've seen, would, among other things, put into the decision-making process for the Western grid states like Utah and Wyoming that are, in some cases, actively litigating California's clean energy and climate policies or funding efforts to undermine them. So I think we have to think really carefully about where we go with this. But I would separate the question and say a regional grid based on the kinds of activities that the CalISO has undertaken, the energy imbalance market and the new EDAM, those kinds of things are good conversations to have. Bringing another bill into the legislature to decapitate the CalISO and to get rid of the governing board, I think is, it's a perfectly fine debate to have, but I don't see it going anywhere constructively when we have so much else on our plate to address.
And just to build on what Kip was saying, the EDAM the market design is being worked on right now with several working groups. This will be a process going through 2022. The market will launch in 2023. It's highly anticipated by all EIM entities. And as I said, they cover over 83% of the greater West. It will allow for more benefits to be captured by all of the participants. With the success of EIM, we've kind of, created an atmosphere of where people want more and are more excited about the larger market, which the day-ahead market will provide. And I would say, let's see how that launches and how it works in 2023. We're all anticipating that it'll be wildly successful, and then take it from there. But that will lead to capturing much more of the benefits in the market and taking us a long way towards where we need to be.
Okay, well, we are at 11:30, and I'm sorry I've been scanning the questions as we go and grabbing a few out. I have to ask one, though, just so Ed can give his standard response. And Ed, it's exactly what you anticipated. Can Ed or others provide an update on NEM 3.0?
This I can actually say because it's been in the docket. There will be a proposed decision mailed on, I believe, December 13th. And other than that, at this point, I'm not in liberty to talk about what's going to be in the proposed decision.
All right. So I'm sure that, well, you provided some good information. We're going to see a published decision shortly. So really great questions over here. I'm going to figure out how we can capture the questions. But there's just so much to talk about, right? That's the problem. But I really think you hit on some very important themes here. I really was interested in the discussion around rates and affordability and reliability as we go forward. So if I was going to say, does anyone have any last words? Yes,
Yeah,
Siva, go for it. You can sum it up for us.
No, I can't sum it up. It's a really good conversation. Again, I'm so glad to be able to be on the dais and learn from everybody. I just wanted to use 10 seconds to say congratulations to Ed, and just kind of recognizing his decade-long service to the state. CPUC, it's one of the hardest jobs staff jobs, and for somebody to be able to do that for 10 years takes a lot of you. So Ed, thank you. We'll miss you, and I don't know how we'll get through. Can't imagine another person taking the job. Thanks.
I'm not going to say goodbye to Ed because I fully expect to be working with him in whatever capacity he may morph into. He's too much of an energy expert not to be providing us with valuable advice and insight along the way. So thank you, Ed, and thank you, Beth, for this opportunity and for this discussion. It was great to be able to talk with Kip and Siva and Ed and discuss the issues of the day. Onwards and upwards to 100%.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you. And I have to say, Ed, there was some clapping there for you. People don't hate you. I think at the 2019 annual meeting, which you've come to every single annual meeting, so I want to say thank you for that. But I think that's how you started off your comments in 2019 is like, I'm the guy you hate. Here I am. So I applaud your bravery in showing up every year. Really appreciate it. But you got a lot of love there.
I'll just take it. It's easier to applaud me when I can't see you, I guess. But thank you very much for the kind words. And this is not goodbye for me. I will, the climate.
Oh, did we freeze him?
He froze.
That was so appropriate. And Ed's gone. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much to the rest of you. I think that's hilarious. The hook came and grabbed Ed. Thank you for figuring out this new platform with me and participating. You guys did a great job. And I'm really looking forward to 2022 and collaborating. Just to let you know, CalCCA is opening up a new office in Sacramento. So Kip, I do hope that the numbers start going the right way with COVID, and I'm going to see a lot more of you folks up in Sacramento. So thanks again so much. I'll let them take you off the stage now. Thanks.
Bye.
All right. We're going to make a transition here.